3 Emmy nominations, 2 Golden Globe nods, a Guinness World Record for the highest paid actor on television per episode in the history of the medium, up to $1.8 million per episode at his peak. That's one side of it. Now, here's the other side. A gunshot in a bedroom, a guilty plea in a Colorado courthouse, on Christmas Day. A phrase, 3 words that would follow him into every headline for the rest of his life: tiger blood. What nobody told you is that both of those men were the same person at the same time, more often than you'd think. His name was Carlos Erwin Estevez. You know him as Charlie Sheen. And this is the story of a man who inherited a name that was supposed to mean light and spent 30 years finding out exactly how much darkness that name could hold. In the next 50 minutes, you're going to learn 4 things nobody told you about Charlie Sheen. First, the exact number behind the Guinness World Record that made him the highest paid actor in television history per episode, and what that number quietly bought him, besides houses. Second, a sworn courtroom admission from 1995 that most fans have never heard of. A specific dollar figure given under oath that connected Charlie Sheen to one of the most notorious names in Hollywood scandal history, years before anyone was talking about winning. Third, the 4 words, the exact phrase that got him fired from the most watched sitcom in America, and the 8 episodes, and the lawsuit that came after it. Fourth, a single year, one that quietly connects his most infamous public breakdown to a private medical diagnosis he would keep secret for 4 more years, at a cost of millions of dollars to keep it that way. I'll let you know when each one comes up. If you leave before the end, you'll miss the most important part. Because by the time we get there, you won't just know what happened to Charlie Sheen. You'll understand how a man with 3 Emmy nominations and a Guinness record became a man whose entire legacy, for a while, got reduced to one memeable word. Let's go back to the beginning. Origin. The 3rd of September 1965. That's the day Carlos Erwin Estevez was born, into a family that already understood the particular math of Hollywood, how a name could become a mask, and how a mask could become a whole career. His father was Martin Sheen. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it's going to matter later. Martin Sheen wasn't born Sheen either. He adopted that stage name as a young actor in honor of Fulton J. Sheen, the Catholic archbishop who became famous across America for his television sermons on faith, discipline, and moral clarity. Remember that name. You'll need it later. So Charlie, born Carlos, raised inside a working actor's household, inherited a stage name that had never really belonged to his own family to begin with. A name his father had borrowed from a bishop known for exactly the opposite of chaos. A name that, at its root, means shine, light. He had an older brother too. Emilio Estevez kept the family name and built his own acting career under it, a separate path, right there in the same house. 2 brothers, 2 names. One stayed Estevez, one carried the borrowed light of Sheen out into the world. This was a second-generation Hollywood family, and that detail matters more than it might seem. Charlie didn't grow up outside the industry, looking in through the window. He grew up inside it, watching how the machine actually worked, long before he ever stood in front of a camera himself. He saw the premieres, he saw the pressure, and, according to his own later account, he also saw or found the shortcuts. Here's the thing about growing up inside a famous family. Everyone assumes the story is that fame corrupted the kid, that Hollywood took someone innocent and broke them. But the documented record on Charlie Sheen doesn't support that clean version of events. According to his own memoir, The Book of Sheen, published decades later in 2025, he has said in his own words, looking back on his life, that he started smoking marijuana at 11 years old. He tried cocaine while he was still in high school. 11. Sit with that number for a second, because it's going to keep showing up throughout this entire story in different forms for the next 3 decades. Long before there was a record-breaking contract, long before there was a television show watched by tens of millions of people every week. Long before anyone had ever heard the words tiger blood, there was an 11-year-old kid in a famous family who had already started down a road that most people, if they walk it at all, don't start walking until years later. This is the first thread running through this story, a pattern that predates the fame. Fame didn't create it. Fame just gave it a bigger stage, better lighting, and a dramatically larger budget. It's worth being precise about what we do and don't know here, because that precision is the whole point of telling a story like this one honestly. We don't have a documented account of exactly how an 11-year-old in a working actor's household first got access to marijuana, or what specific circumstances surrounded that first experience. Sheen's own memoir gives us the fact, the age, the substance, the general timeline, without a detailed scene to go along with it, so we won't invent one. What we can say, with confidence, is the shape of it, a pattern beginning in childhood, inside a family already fluent in the machinery of Hollywood, well before any studio executive had ever heard the name Charlie Sheen. And that borrowed name Sheen, light, shine, was about to spend the next 50 years being tested against exactly how much darkness it could actually hold. Here's the thing worth pausing on before we move forward. There isn't a documented account of some single traumatic event in Charlie Sheen's childhood that explains everything that came later. No one incident, no one betrayal, no one clean origin story for the pattern. What the record actually shows is quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling. A kid growing up around fame, in a house where a borrowed name already carried the weight of somebody else's reputation, finding his way to marijuana at 11 and cocaine by his teenage years, not because anything catastrophic pushed him there, at least not anything that's been publicly documented, but because the access was there, and the guardrails, whatever they were, didn't hold. That's worth sitting with, because it changes the shape of everything that comes next. This isn't a story about a good life gone bad because of one poisoned decision. It's a story about a pattern that got a decades-long head start on the fame, the money, and the reputation that would eventually make it impossible to ignore. The rise. By the time Charlie Sheen was a young man, he wasn't trying to break into Hollywood from the outside. He was already standing inside it. But becoming Charlie Sheen the movie star, not just Martin Sheen's son, that still had to happen on its own terms, and when it happened fast. Oliver Stone cast him in Platoon, a war film set in Vietnam that would go on to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. This was Sheen's breakout role, the first time mainstream audiences saw him not as somebody's son, but as an actor carrying real dramatic weight on his own. Then, just 1 year later, something happened that almost never happens in this industry. In 1987, Oliver Stone's follow-up film, Wall Street, put Charlie Sheen and Martin Sheen on screen together, father and son. The borrowed name and the man who'd borrowed it, sharing frame space, telling a story about ambition, greed, and what they cost a person. Two Sheens. One built the name, the other was still figuring out what he owed it. Over the years that followed, Sheen kept building, and not just in serious prestige territory. Red Dawn, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Later, the Scary Movie franchise, where he showed he could do broad comedy as easily as he'd done Vietnam-era drama. That range, war film to teen comedy to studio spoof, is part of what made him bankable across more than one kind of audience for more than one kind of decade. He wasn't a one-genre actor. He was a name people trusted across genres, which is a much rarer thing in Hollywood than it sounds. But the role that would define him, the one that turned Charlie Sheen from a working actor's name into something closer to a cultural institution, didn't arrive until 2003. That year, he signed on to play Charlie Harper on CBS's 2.5 Men. And here's what nobody tells you about exactly how big that show got. It didn't just do well. It became, at its peak, the most watched sitcom in the entire United States. Not one of the most watched, the most watched, full stop. This is the first revelation I promised you at the beginning. Charlie Sheen didn't just become a well-paid television actor playing a hit character. He became, according to Guinness World Records, the the highest-paid actor in television history on a per-episode basis. Reported figures for what he earned per episode range between $1.25 million and $1.8 million, depending on the year and the specific source you check. But even at the conservative end of that range, run the math across a 22-episode season, and you land on a number that almost no actor in the history of the medium has ever touched. Along the way, the role also picked up 3 Emmy nominations and 2 Golden Globe nominations for him personally. Sit with that figure for a second. Up to $1.8 million for a single episode of a network sitcom, shot in front of a live audience, running roughly 22 episodes a year. That's not really a salary at that point. That's closer to the annual revenue of a small company paid out weekly to one man to deliver jokes about a slacker bachelor's beach house in Malibu. And unlike a lot of Hollywood pay figures, which tend to be estimates, rumors, or numbers leaked by unnamed sources with an agenda, this one came with an official seal on it. Guinness World Records doesn't hand out a title like highest paid television actor per episode based on a tabloid rumor. It requires documentation. It requires verification. Somewhere, there is paperwork, contracts, studio filings, some auditable trail that a third-party organization looked at and certified as record-breaking. That's a different category of fact than sources say. That's closer to a matter of public, verifiable record, the same category of fact as a birth certificate or a court transcript. Keep that distinction in mind, because it's going to come up again later in this story in a very different context. It's also worth putting that number next to what a typical, successful network sitcom actor was earning around that same era, figures that, even for well-known stars on hit shows, generally sat in the tens of thousands of dollars per episode, not the millions. Sheen wasn't just earning more than his peers. He was earning in a completely different numerical category than almost anyone else working in episodic television, at any network, on any show, at that specific moment in time. There's also the matter of what a record like that does to a person's sense of their own leverage. Once you've been externally, officially certified as the single most valuable per-episode performer in the history of a medium, it becomes very easy to start believing your own position is permanent, that no single decision, no single outburst, no single lawsuit could actually threaten something with that much institutional weight behind it. That belief turned out to be wrong, but it's worth understanding why it might have felt, from the inside, like a reasonable thing to believe. Records like that don't come with an expiration date printed on them. Nobody hands you a warning label along with a Guinness certificate. Here's the thing about a number like that. It doesn't just buy houses and watches. It buys distance. Distance from consequences. Distance from the people in your life who might normally, in a smaller world, be the ones to tell you no. When you are, by an official, external record-keeping body, the single highest-paid person in your entire profession, on a per-episode basis, the people around you start recalibrating. Studio executives don't want to lose their most valuable asset. Producers don't want to rock the boat on the show carrying their network's Thursday night. And that kind of financial gravity, real, documented, provable, has a way of insulating the person at the center of it from the ordinary checks that catch most people long before things go too far. By 2003, Charlie Sheen sat at the exact center of that gravity. But, and this is important, the money and the show weren't happening in a vacuum, off in some separate, clean timeline. They were happening at the same time as a private life that had already, quietly, been showing cracks for years. Because before 2.5 Men ever premiered, before the Guinness record, before any of the numbers that made him one of the best compensated actors alive on planet Earth, Charlie Sheen had already lived through incidents that most casual fans of the sitcom had no idea about. We're about to get into those, but hold on to this for a second. An 11-year-old with a habit, a father who built an entire public identity on a name borrowed from a bishop who preached discipline. And now, By 2003, a grown man sitting on top of the highest paid role in television history, 3 different points on the same line. The line was about to bend hard. Because here's what almost nobody watching 2.5 Men on a Monday night in 2005 or 2006 or 2007 actually knew. The man delivering those punchlines every week, the one earning more per episode than most actors earn in a career, wasn't a clean success story, quietly living a normal life off camera. He was a man whose private history already included things the audience had no visibility into at all, things that had happened years before the show even existed, and things that were still actively unfolding behind the scenes while the cameras kept rolling on schedule, week after week, season after season. The show didn't cause any of that, but it didn't stop it either. It just kept paying and kept airing while it built up. There's a specific kind of American celebrity story that this fits into, and it's worth naming, because it's not unique to Charlie Sheen. It just happened to him at a scale and a visibility that made it impossible to look away from. It's the story of extraordinary professional output, running in parallel with extraordinary personal instability for years, without either one visibly slowing the other down. Audiences tend to assume those two things should cancel each other out, that a man in genuine crisis couldn't possibly also be delivering award-nominated, record-setting work, week after week, on schedule. But the documented record says otherwise. For a long stretch of years, Charlie Sheen did both at once. That's not an excuse for anything that came later. It's just a more accurate description of what was actually happening than the version most people carry around in their heads. The crack. Here's what nobody tells you about the timeline. Some of the darkest, least discussed moments in Charlie Sheen's life didn't happen after his fame peaked. They happened years, even decades, before most casual viewers had any reason to be paying attention to his personal life at all. Go back to 1990. Sheen was involved in a relationship with the actress Kelly Preston. According to the documented account, he accidentally shot Preston in the arm while the two of them were living together. A genuine accident, not an act of violence, but a shooting all the same, with a real injury and a real hospital visit behind it. Decades later, in 2011, Preston herself addressed it publicly, telling TMZ plainly, it was an accident. Preston passed away in 2020. And a 2025 documentary would go on to revisit this episode of Sheen's life in more detail decades after it happened. Think about what that means for the timeline. This wasn't some late career unraveling. This was 1,990 years before 2.5 Men, years before the Guinness record, when Charlie Sheen was still in the early stretch of building the film career that would define his 20s. The pattern wasn't waiting for fame to peak before it showed itself. It was already there. And notice something else about that story. It isn't framed in the documented record as an act of intentional violence. It's described as an accident. That distinction matters, and it's worth being precise about it, because precision is the whole point of a story like this one. This isn't a tally of every bad thing a famous person has ever been accused of. It's a specific, documented chain of events, some of them accidents, some of them choices, some of them crimes he pleaded guilty to, and telling them apart from each other is part of understanding what actually happened instead of just what got remembered. 5 years after that, in 1995, came a moment that's almost entirely absent from the popular, meme-driven version of the Charlie Sheen story. And it's worth pulling into the light, because it's a matter of public court record. This is the second revelation I promised you at the beginning. In 1995, Sheen testified in the tax evasion trial of Heidi Fleiss, the woman widely known in the press as the Hollywood Madame, convicted of running a high-end prostitution ring whose client list reportedly touched some of the most recognizable names in the entertainment industry. Under oath, in a courtroom, Charlie Sheen admitted to having been a client of hers to the tune of roughly $50,000 in total. $50,000 under oath in open court. In 1995, 8 years before he ever set foot on the set of 2.5 men. Here's why that date matters so much. The popular narrative around Charlie Sheen tends to treat his troubles as something that happened to him after the show made him famous, as if the pressure of the sitcom, or the money, or the fame it brought, is what eventually broke him. But a sworn courtroom admission from 1995 doesn't fit that story. It suggests something less comfortable, that the patterns that would later blow up his career in the most public way possible were already fully formed, years before that career reached its financial peak. The success didn't create the crisis. The success just got layered on top of a crisis that had already been running in the background for years. And it kept running, even as his public, official life looked like it was moving in the opposite direction toward stability, toward family. In 2002, Sheen married actress Denise Richards. Over the course of that marriage, which lasted until 2006, the couple had 2 daughters together. On paper, in the tabloids of that era, this looked like a settling down chapter, a Hollywood leading man building a family life alongside a hit-making career. But the marriage ended in 2006, the same general period during which 2.5 Men was climbing toward its status as the most-watched sitcom in America. Public image and private reality were, once again, running on 2 different tracks. There's a version of this story that treats each marriage as a fresh start, a reset button, a sign that this time things would be different. And on some level, that's probably how it looked from the inside too. A wedding is, structurally, an optimistic act. Nobody walks down an aisle planning for a courtroom later. But the documented record shows a man moving from one significant relationship into another, across more than 2 decades, while the same underlying patterns kept resurfacing in between them, regardless of who he was married to at the time. That's an important distinction. This isn't a story about one bad marriage. It's a story about a man carrying the same weight into multiple different marriages, one after another. Sheen was married a total of 3 times over the course of his life. The 2 most publicly documented are the ones we're covering here, Denise Richards and Brooke Mueller, but the broader point stands, regardless of which marriage you're looking at, 3 attempts, across roughly 2 decades, at the same basic goal of building a stable family life, running the entire time alongside a private pattern that had already been documented as far back as 1990. 3 chances for a different outcome. The pattern doesn't seem to have asked which wife was standing next to it at the time. The marriage to Denise Richards produced 2 daughters and ran from 2002 to 2006, meaning it began the year before 2.5 Men premiered and ended 3 years into the show's run. Right as Sheen's public profile and his paycheck were both climbing toward their peak. Whatever was happening inside that marriage, it was happening directly underneath the loudest, most visible professional success of his entire career. 2 timelines, once again, running on top of each other instead of one after the other. Then, in 2008, he married Brooke Mueller. The 2 of them would go on to have twin sons together, born during the marriage. And it's this second marriage to Brooke Mueller that produces one of the most concrete, documented turning points in this entire story. On Christmas Day, in December of 2009, Charlie Sheen was arrested in Aspen, Colorado, on a charge of domestic violence involving Brooke Mueller. He ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser assault charge. The court sentence, probation, along with mandated anger management classes. Christmas Day, not a random Tuesday in the middle of a chaotic year. Christmas, a day built, culturally, around the idea of family, of home, of everything being fine. And instead, it became the day Charlie Sheen was arrested for domestic violence against his own wife. Here's what makes this section of the story different from a lot of celebrity scandal arcs. There isn't a single villain here, a single outside figure who corrupts an otherwise stable man. There's no equivalent of a bad business manager or a predatory hanger-on who talked him into anything. The documented record points, again and again, back to the same person making the same kinds of decisions, going back at least as far as 1992 decades before the Aspen arrest. and 13 years before the show that would eventually make him a household name even reached the air. That's the uncomfortable shape of this particular story. The crack wasn't a single event. It was a pattern, repeating on a schedule for 20 years, mostly out of public view, until the public view got a lot harder to avoid. By the end of 2009, Charlie Sheen was, by almost every external measure available to the public, at the height of his career. 2.5 Men was still the most watched sitcom in the country. The paycheck was still record-setting. The Emmy and Golden Globe nominations were still coming in. And on Christmas Day of that same year, he was in handcuffs in Aspen. Those two facts sat right next to each other on the calendar, not years apart, not in two separate eras of his life you could cleanly divide into before and after. At the exact same moment, in the exact same man, both things were true. The highest paid actor on television and a man on probation for domestic violence, mandated into anger management classes by a court. That's not a contradiction the way a plot twist is a contradiction. It's closer to how these stories actually work in real life, messier, less linear, with the worst and the best happening close enough together that neither one ever really gets to exist without the other standing right next to it. Here's the thing about anger management classes, court-ordered or otherwise. They're not a punchline, even though they sometimes get treated like one in celebrity coverage. They're a structured, months-long intervention, mandated by a judge, specifically because a court determined that intervention was necessary. That's not a detail that fits neatly into the tiger blood version of this story that most people carry around. It's a quieter, more procedural fact: a judge, a courtroom, a sentence, a mandated class sitting right there in the public record, largely ignored by a culture that was, by that point, far more interested in the version of Charlie Sheen that made for a better headline: The Fall. By early 2011, the pieces that had been quietly stacking up for 2 decades were about to come down all at once, in public, in real time, on camera. Sheen entered rehab for the 3rd time in 12 months, 3 stays, inside a single calendar year, while 2.5 Men still, at that point, one of the most watched shows on American television, was on production hiatus around him. 3 attempts at getting stable in the space of 1 year tells you something on its own. Whatever was happening wasn't a single bad stretch. It was something that kept returning, faster than it could be treated. Picture what that actually looked like from the inside of that production, even without a single quoted line of private dialogue to describe it. A hit network show, built around a tight weekly shooting schedule, with its lead actor cycling in and out of treatment 3 separate times in under 12 months, crews rescheduling around him. A studio and a network, both of whom had enormous financial incentive to keep the show running smoothly, watching their most valuable asset become less and less predictable by the month. Nobody needs an invented quote to understand the tension in a room like that. The math alone tells the story. 3 stays in rehab, 1 calendar year, 1 production that couldn't simply replace its star without consequences of its own. Then came March of 2011. And this is where the story stops being something you'd only find in a court filing or an old tabloid clipping, and becomes something an entire country watched unfold, essentially live. This is the 3rd revelation I promised you at the beginning. Sheen was fired from 2.5 Men after he publicly called the show's creator, Chuck Lorre, a contaminated little maggot. 4 words. Said publicly about the man who had created the highest-rated comedy vehicle of Sheen's entire career, the same show responsible for that Guinness World Record salary, Warner Brothers, responded by canceling the remaining 8 episodes of that season outright, not delaying them, not recasting a single role, and canceling them. 8 episodes of the most-watched sitcom in America, scrapped because of a public feud between its star and its creator. Sheen didn't go quietly after that. He sued both Chuck Lorre and Warner Brothers for wrongful termination, turning a public insult into a formal legal battle, adding lawyers and depositions to a story that was already spinning out in the press. And in the space between being fired and that lawsuit playing out, Sheen gave a run of interviews to ABC, to 20/20 to CBS that would end up defining how an entire generation remembers this period of his life more than any single episode of the actual television show ever did. It's in these interviews that a set of phrases entered the American pop culture vocabulary almost overnight. Tiger blood, Adonis DNA, I'm not bipolar, I'm bi-winning. In these same interviews, Sheen explicitly denied having bipolar disorder, and he defended his history of drug use rather than distancing himself from it. The interviews were erratic enough and quotable enough that clips from them went viral in a way that very few pieces of unscripted celebrity television ever had up to that point. Think about the mechanics of that virality for a second, because it matters for how this whole chapter got remembered. This was 2011 social media, old enough to move fast, young enough that a clip like this hadn't really had a precedent to follow. Within days, winning wasn't just something Charlie Sheen said in an interview. It was a t-shirt. It was a ringtone. It was a phrase people were shouting at each other as a joke, completely detached from the man who'd said it, or the reason he'd said it. A national television audience watched a person in visible crisis, and a huge portion of that audience responded not with concern, but with merchandise. That's not a knock on any one viewer, it's just what happens when a genuine breakdown gets served up in the exact format the internet is built to turn into a punchline. The format won, the context lost. Here's the thing about that period that's easy to lose looking back at it now, mostly through meme compilations and highlight reels. At the time, this wasn't just entertaining internet chaos. It was a man in the middle of what looks, from a distance, like a full public breakdown happening on camera, on major television networks, in front of an audience of millions, while his career, his marriage history, and his health were all colliding at the same moment. The internet turned winning into a punchline. Underneath the punchline was a documented pattern going back to age 11, now playing out on national television in real time. The show itself moved on without him. He was replaced, starting with season 9, by Ashton Kutcher, stepping into a role built around Sheen's absence rather than his character. The most watched sitcom in America kept running. Its original star did not. And there's one more piece of this era that most retrospectives leave out entirely. Because it wasn't public yet, it wouldn't become public for another 4 years. During this same period, in the middle of the rehab stays, the firing, the lawsuit, and the tiger blood interviews, Charlie Sheen was privately dealing with something the cameras weren't capturing at all. We'll get to exactly what that was, and why it changes how you should think about everything you just watched him say on television in a moment. But before we get there, it's worth being honest about something the public record simply doesn't give us. Nobody outside Charlie Sheen's closest circle, at the time, could have known what was actually driving those interviews. Addiction alone is a serious, sufficient explanation on its own. It doesn't need anything else added to it to make sense of erratic public behavior. The documented rehab stays, the documented pattern going back to age 11, the documented arrest just over a year earlier, all of that, by itself, is enough to explain a man in visible crisis. What nobody watching at the time had access to was the other thing running underneath it, at the exact same moment, completely invisible to the cameras. Consider too what those interview sets probably looked like from the other side of the camera for the network producers who booked him, for the hair and makeup teams, for the crew running the segments. None of that is documented in a way that lets us put invented words in anyone's mouth. But the outline of it doesn't require invention. A major television network choosing to air a visibly unstable man's interviews because the ratings and the clicks were undeniable is itself part of the documented shape of this story. The cameras didn't cause the crisis, but they didn't look away from it either, not when it was this profitable to keep rolling. Recovery and present. Here's what nobody tells you about the 17th of November 2015, and it's the fourth revelation I promised you at the beginning. First day. On that date, Charlie Sheen sat down for an interview with Matt Lauer on NBC's Today Show and announced publicly that he was HIV positive. He stated that he had been diagnosed 4 years earlier, which places the actual diagnosis at approximately 2011. Read that again. 2011. The same year as the third rehab stay in 12 months. The same year as the firing from 2.5 Men. The same year as Tiger Blood, Adonis DNA, and I'm not bipolar, I'm bi-winning, said live on national television to millions of people. For 4 years, while the entire country was treating his public unraveling as a story about addiction and erratic behavior, which, by every account, it also was Charlie Sheen, was carrying a private medical diagnosis that he had chosen not to disclose. According to his own account, he paid what he described as millions of dollars, up to roughly $10 million, by his own estimate to people who were blackmailing him with the threat of revealing his HIV status, including at least one sex worker who had photographed his medication as leverage. In that same Today interview, he stated categorically that it was impossible that he had transmitted the virus to anyone. Sit with the layering of that for a second. The public was watching a meltdown and reading it one way as chaos, as excess, as a punchline. Behind it, at the exact same time, was a private medical secret being managed through years of extortion payments large enough to be measured in the millions. Two completely different stories running on top of each other, and the public only ever had access to one of them in real time. The disclosure itself, in 2015, functionally ended the blackmail. There's nothing left to threaten to reveal once someone has said it publicly, on national television, in their own words. In that narrow sense, the interview with Matt Lauer wasn't just a confession. It was also, functionally, the end of a very specific kind of leverage that other people had been holding over him for 4 straight years. There's something worth naming plainly here, without dressing it up. Paying up to $10 million over 4 years to keep a single piece of information private is not a normal financial decision. It's the kind of number that only makes sense if you understand exactly how much a man in his position believed he had to lose, not just in dollars, but in the way an entire industry and an entire audience might have treated him differently had they known sooner. Whether that fear was justified or not isn't something this video can answer for you. But the size of that number tells you how real the fear was to the person paying it. The fallout from this entire stretch of his life kept surfacing well after the headlines around Tiger Blood had faded. In 2018, it was revealed that Sheen owed close to $5 million in back taxes, dating to the 2015 tax year. One more concrete, documented consequence trailing behind everything else, showing up on the books years after the interviews that made him famous for an entirely different reason. Notice the shape of that fact too, sitting right next to the earlier one about the Guinness record. Both are matters of official, third-party, verified record. One, a record-setting salary, certified by an outside organization. The other, a tax debt, tracked by a government agency. Two very different kinds of institutions, both keeping their own independent paper trail on the same man, years apart, telling two very different stories about where the money actually went. But here's where this story, unlike a lot of scandal arcs, actually bends back towards something more settled. In 2023, Sheen repaired his professional relationship with Chuck Lorre, the same man he had once publicly called a contaminated little maggot, the same man he had sued for wrongful termination over a decade earlier. He went on to appear in Bookie, a series created by that same Chuck Lorre. Two men who had been on opposite sides of a lawsuit, working together again more than a decade after the 4 words that ended their partnership the first time. And in 2025, Sheen went further than repairing one relationship. He published a memoir, The Book of Sheen, and starred in a 2-part Netflix documentary titled AKA Charlie Sheen, released on September 10, 2025, in which he openly walks back through his entire history of addiction and public scandal, on his own terms this time, rather than through a leaked interview clip or a courtroom transcript. According to his own recent statements, he is currently sober. Think about what it means, structurally, for a man like this to choose a memoir and a documentary as his next major public act, rather than another interview clipped for virality. A live interview, like the one that produced Tiger Blood, hands control of the narrative to whoever's editing the footage afterward, the network, the internet, the meme accounts. A memoir and a two-part documentary made on his own terms years later, with the benefit of hindsight and, by his own account, sobriety, is a fundamentally different kind of act. It's not damage control. It's closer to an attempt to be the one finally telling the story, in full, in order, instead of having it told about him in fragments by other people for 14 years. That doesn't erase anything. It doesn't undo the arrest, or the canceled episodes, or the 4 words that ended a partnership, or the 4 years a diagnosis stayed hidden behind blackmail payments. But it does mark a genuine shift in who's holding the pen. For most of this story, the version of events belonged to tabloids, to viral clips, to court documents filed by other people's lawyers. By 2025, for the first time in a long time, at least part of the record belonged to Charlie Sheen himself. Which brings us back to that detail I ask you to remember, all the way back at the beginning of this story. His father, Martin Sheen, borrowed the name Sheen from Archbishop Fulton Sheen, a man famous for preaching discipline, faith, and moral clarity to millions of television viewers, decades before his son would become famous in that exact same medium for the opposite of all three. Charlie Sheen spent most of his adult life testing exactly how much darkness that borrowed name could hold, a name that literally means shine, worn by a man whose most famous public moments were the ones where everything came apart on camera. Now, in his 60s, sober by his own account, having repaired the relationship with the man who fired him, and having chosen, finally, to tell his own version of the story in his own memoir and his own documentary, that name is being tested one more time. Not by another collapse, by whether it can still mean something closer to what it was originally supposed to mean, the truth. So here's the truth about Charlie Sheen. We started this video with 2 versions of the same man, side by side. The Guinness World Record holder pulling up to $1.8 million an episode, and the man on Christmas Day, in handcuffs, in Aspen. Both of those were real, documented, verifiable facts about the same person, often happening within a few short years, sometimes within the same year of each other. The first revelation was the record itself, the exact, staggering number behind the highest paid role in television history, and the way that kind of money quietly buys distance from consequences right up until it doesn't. The second was a $50,000 admission, made under oath in 1995, connecting him to one of the most infamous scandals in Hollywood history. 8 full years before the sitcom that made him a household name even premiered proof that the pattern didn't start with fame. It was there first. The third was 4 words, a contaminated little maggot, that ended his run on the most watched sitcom in America, canceled 8 episodes outright, and produced a run of viral interviews that reduced a 50-year life for a lot of people down to a single memeable word, winning. And the fourth was a single year, 2011, hiding in plain sight behind the loudest, most public breakdown of his career, a private HIV diagnosis, kept secret for 4 years, at a cost of millions of dollars, while the entire country thought it was only watching a story about addiction. Here's what all 4 of those revelations point to, together. The easy version of a celebrity downfall story has a single villain, a single bad decision, a single moment where everything tips over. Charlie Sheen's story doesn't have that. It has a pattern that started at 11 years old, decades before the fame, and a public that only ever got to see the loudest, most quotable fragments of a much longer, much more private story, one that was still unfolding behind closed doors, even while the cameras were rolling on the version everyone remembers. He carried a name that was supposed to mean light. For a long stretch of his life, in full public view, it meant almost the opposite. What the last few years suggest the reconciliation with Chuck Lorre, the memoir, the documentary made on his own terms, the sobriety he now speaks about openly, is that the story isn't finished being written in only one direction. That's the real weight of fame at this level. It doesn't just amplify your best moments, it amplifies your worst ones too, on the exact same schedule, whether you're ready or not. Charlie Sheen spent 30 years finding that out in front of an audience most people never have to perform for. And maybe that's the actual lesson buried underneath all the numbers and dates in this story. The Guinness record, the $50,000 admission, the 4 words that got him fired. The 4 years a diagnosis stayed hidden. Fame doesn't hand out a verdict on who someone really is. It just hands them a bigger stage, a louder microphone, and a much larger audience for whatever's already true about them, good and bad, at the exact same time. Whether the world is ready to hold both of those truths at once or not, most of the time, it isn't. Most of the time, it picks the version that fits in a headline, or a t-shirt, or a 3-word meme, and lets the rest of the story quietly disappear. This video was an attempt to put the rest of it back. A Guinness World Record, a sworn courtroom admission, 4 words that ended a decade-long partnership, a 4-year secret paid for at a cost most people will never earn in their lives. None of those are the invention of a screenwriter, or the exaggeration of a tabloid, or a rumor repeated so many times it hardened into fact. They're documented, verifiable, on the record in contracts, in court transcripts, in tax filings, in a network interview transcript that millions of people watched live. The story didn't need embellishment to be dramatic. It just needed someone to put all 4 pieces back in the same room at the same time. Instead of letting the loudest 3 words of one afternoon in 2011 stand in for 50 years of an actual, complicated, documented life. If this story hit different than the version you thought you knew, that's the point. So you don't miss the next one, the next real story, told with the receipts to back it up. Make sure you're subscribed.